Welcome to the first episode of Beyond the Desk, a podcast of West Allis Public Library. We'll talk about books, resources, lifelong learning, and what makes our community great. And in this episode, we'll talk about books based on a true story.
I'm Elizabeth, and I am going to join you on the podcast, Sarah. And I work here in the adult reference area, and I collect for certain collections at the library, and I do programs like this.
And as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm Sarah. I'm new to the library. I just started in October of last year. I also work in adult services. In addition to finding me at the reference desk, I also work on programs for adults. I coordinate the WAPL home delivery program, which is for people who can't make it into the library and don't have somebody to come to the library for them to check out materials. I also work on the print and e-newsletters and social media. And I'm really excited to be back at West Allis because I grew up going to West Allis Public Library, and I also attended grade school at St. Aloysius on 92nd and Greenfield. So it's a little bit of a homecoming for me.
That's so nice. And today we're going to be talking about books that have a basis in a true story.
That's right.
The most recent book that I've read is Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. It's a 2017 book, historical fiction, young adult. It follows the story of a boat that was sunk after the Second World War by Soviet submarines. There were so many people who died. 9,400 people died at the last estimate. Very sad story. So that was my first option.
And can you tell us a little bit about some of the characters in the story?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there were 4 main characters, and it switches between each individual. So you'll have one chapter for one and follow their stories, and they're quite varied in their personalities and their involvement in the story, but they all end up on the same ship and getting to know each other in certain capacities. And then after the sinking of the ship, what happens to certain individuals? Some of them make it, some of them don't.
And where did you say they were traveling from?
They were trying to escape from Prussia, as it was known then, and they were crossing the Baltic Sea and trying to make it. I'm not exactly sure exactly where they were ending up, but they were just trying to leave Prussia and get to safety after World War II, which I imagine it was a very dangerous place and time to be there.
Yeah, and I remember you telling me about this story and how it's kind of an overlooked story with all of what has happened in World War II, and so it's a story maybe we don't often hear about.
Yes, it's absolutely a story that I never knew about until I read this book. We always hear about the Titanic. Obviously, it was a terrible disaster, but yeah, the timing meant that this sinking kind of just gets shuffled to one side in history.
Have you read anything else by the author?
No, I haven't, but since I enjoyed this one so much, I probably will keep her in mind, add her to my to-be-read list.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about Georgia by Dawn Tripp. It's about Georgia O'Keeffe, and more specifically about her relationship with Alfred Stieglitz, the photographer, who was her husband. I have always been really interested in Georgia O'Keeffe because I grew up here in Wisconsin, going to the Milwaukee Art Museum, and we're lucky to have some Georgia O'Keeffe paintings in the collection at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And I remember as a kid going to the museum, and we got a wonderful tour from one of the docents. And on the tour was Georgia O'Keeffe's Gray and Brown Leaves. And I remember them telling us about Georgia O'Keeffe and how she was an important artist, not just a woman artist, but she was also from Wisconsin, which was really cool as a kid to hear that there's this
connection.
Exactly, yeah. And so I was just always really taken, and I like her work. You know, the kind of work that she's known for is these up-close, intimate portraits of flowers. And in the case that I was talking about, it was a couple of leaves. And, you know, we think of landscapes a lot, and I love landscapes, but she was doing something different. You know, the Impressionists were looking at how light, trying to capture light in nature, and she was doing something where it was like really kind of putting you in this kind of perspective where you're really looking close up at nature, and it was just something different. And so I've always been a fan of Georgia O'Keeffe's. So when I saw this book, I was interested because I didn't really know that much about her. I knew she, of course, moved to New York and then to New Mexico, and I knew she was married to Alfred Stieglitz, but I didn't really know much about their relationship. And in Georgia, Dawn Tripp explains that she went to a show and she kind of fell in love with the abstract paintings of Georgia O'Keeffe, and so she started investigating, and the show also included some letters between Stieglitz and O'Keeffe, and so there's a lot of letters that survived, and that's what she used kind of to inform this book. It's a novel, so it's not meant to be something that is exactly what happened.
Yes.
But it's very much based in truth and events, real events.
A lot of research and investigation and interviews must have gone into writing it.
Yeah.
Is it mostly the relationship
It is.
between the Stieglitz is his name and Georgia O'Keeffe?
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting choice because so Stieglitz was 23 years older than Georgia O'Keeffe, and he
Wow.
was first married when they started corresponding, really. Before they had met each other, they had, I think, some friend in common, and they were writing to each other, and they were interested in each other's work. And so she, you know, they ended up getting married in 1924, but he died in 46, and she lived another 40 years. So that's an interesting choice that Tripp decides to focus just on their relationship. There's one scene later in the book that kind of is a fast forward, and you do have Georgia kind of towards the end of her life, but the majority of the story, like really the climax of the story is kind of his death and how that impacts her. And it's just really interesting. And I think if you are interested at all in Georgia O'Keeffe, I would definitely recommend checking out this book. Also, I meant to say that Georgia O'Keeffe, the Wisconsin connection, is that she was born on a dairy farm.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That is so Wisconsin.
And it was near Sun Prairie,
Okay.
which is about like 15 miles or so from Madison. And she went to a couple of high schools in Madison before moving on to Virginia, where her family moved. Anyway, I recommend Georgia for people who are interested in
Sounds
her
like a
work.
great option.
Yeah, thank
Yes. No, I think I'm going to try and get that one at some point. My next recommendation actually ties quite nicely with yours because it's also about an artist. The book is named A Piece of the World by Christina Baker Klein. And in fact, it's about the painting which is on the cover of the book called Christina's World. And it's about also the relationship between the painter and the subject of the painting. It's a very sad story that I should let you know. It is definitely a novel. There was a lot of research that probably went into it, but they filled in a lot of the gaps, I think. And it was about Andrew Wyeth, who paints Christina's World, and he comes to know of a young girl at the time that he meets her, Anna Christina Olsen, who lives in this house it's Maine, on her family's farm, and she never leaves that house really to live in other areas of the world. She just stays there, and he just observes her and paints this landscape that is so iconic for so many people. Yeah, so I do definitely recommend it, but it is one of those books you'll need a box of tissues beside you to enjoy.
Well, I think those can be some of the best books. My mom always liked stories that made her cry because they were moving. You know, there's that emotional connection that you have to the characters. And now, this podcast is coming out in April. This is a book club pick, isn't it? Is it for
Yes, it
April?
is. It is a book club pick. I'll be moderating the discussion for that book club. Yes, we have a long-standing Books and Coffee book club. Right now it's by Zoom, but before COVID, we were in person, and we run it once a month. I think I chose it because it just seemed like such a good option, and I hope other people will enjoy it as much as I did.
Do you happen to know where the painting is of Christina's World? I feel like it's either in Chicago or maybe in New York.
I had to research that. It's currently at the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art.
Because I've seen it in person, so I was like,
You have?
Yeah, it's
I
at one of
haven't
those
seen
places.
it. Oh my goodness, I would love to see it in person.
I think that sounds like a great pick because, as you know, Elizabeth, I like stories about artists and deeply admire artists and their work.
Yes.
My next one is Euphoria by Lily King, and some people might have heard of her recently because her book Writers and Lovers, her novel, was on some of the best of lists for 2020. I want to read that one, but because there were a lot of hold requests for that one, I thought I would, go back and read Euphoria, which I had heard great things about. And this one is inspired by the life of anthropologist Margaret Mead. Lily King researched the time that Mead spent with anthropologists Rio Fortune and Gregory Bateson in 1930s New Guinea. And I didn't know anything about really any of these people before I read the book. And it turns out that Mead was married to Fortune and later married to Bateson, and then eventually divorced from Bateson. So that's what happened in real life. This story is a fictional. It's really just inspired by this scenario, this love triangle, if you will. The Mead character is Nell in the book, and she's married to Fen, and Bankson is this English anthropologist who had been studying the native people in New Guinea. He was working with and observing one tribe, and then Nell and Fen end up having to leave where they were and looking for another tribe to kind of focus their research and efforts on. And Bankson really becomes... He starts out in the book, he has attempted to kill himself, and so he's in a really dark place, and when he meets Nell and Fen, just brings some excitement into his life, and he really connects with them in terms of their work, and he really falls for Nell because of her work and what she's doing. She's American. I believe Fen is from New Zealand.
Okay.
But she's already gotten some notice for her work in the field, and to see her work, he just really connects with her because they're all working in the same field. The writing is really fabulous in this story. It's a short book. It's about, I think it's a little over 200 pages. I actually listened to it.
Oh, I love listening to.
It was great because
Yes.
most of the story is told from Bankson's point of view, but you do get Nell's perspective as well. And so in the audio, you get to hear a man reading Bankson's part, and then
Okay.
a woman reads Nell's part, and it's just really enjoyable. It's a very good audiobook, so I do recommend that. And I was reading that on Libby, which you can get through your, with your library card, you register for the
highly
Libby app.
recommend doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And, the other thing that I just wanted to mention is it is a love triangle, but of course they're anthropologists. So the other interesting thing about this story is that you feel a little bit uncomfortable, I think Nell and Bankson are genuinely interested in learning about other people and other cultures, but there is kind of this thievery, if you will, of they're taking this information about these people and then, taking this information and writing about it for a Western audience.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say that Fen is a little bit less sympathetic in the story. And he actually goes to straight out thieving because some of the objects that these Native people have are valuable. So it's an interesting story from that perspective as well.
It sounds fantastic. Very different people involved, and the thieving of the objects sounds like an uncomfortable aspect of reading it, but maybe keeps you on your toes.
By the way, did you end up reading Writers and Lovers?
I wish I could say yes. It was one of those ones I took out and really wanted to, and just I was the one of those ones on the holes list. But no,
sure.
I returned it without really taking much of a step. I know I will pick it up again. I've just been in a different kind of reading phase of my life at the moment because of just needing things that take me away.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I'll get there. She's a great writer, and I'm sure that Euphoria will be one of my ones that I want to add as well as Writers and Lovers. But
I was just curious. I saw it on your desk. So.
I know. I was feeling a little bit guilty when you mentioned her, but yeah, there's so many good books.
So many books, so little time, right?
Yes, exactly. The next one on my list is The Giver of Stars by Jojo Moyes. A lot of people know her because of her other works, but this one is about librarians, and they are who ride on horseback to deliver books to members of their community. And it's based on the true story of librarians who actually did this. And it's in remote Kentucky, so it's not very comfortable terrain to be riding on. And they encounter people in their community who like what they're doing, and there are people in the community who really don't like what they're doing. So issues about what can you read and what you should be sharing with people, and how dangerous it is to be on horseback and taking yourself through remote parts of the world. But yeah,
that sounds like a great story.
Yes, I think a lot of people have really enjoyed it. It's been on a lot of holds on it at the library, bestseller lists. And there's actually a similar one. I forget the author of it. It's Bookwomen of Troublesome Creek. It's about the same group of pack horse librarians, just taking it in a different direction. But I think as a librarian, I really appreciated delving a little bit deeper into what other librarians might have done in different eras.
That one is also popular with book clubs, because I know
Yes.
I've had people requesting that one and having a little
Yes.
trouble getting a hold of it because it's pretty popular.
Yes, yes. If you want to read it, you have to put it on hold, or you can try looking for it in Libby. You'll probably be on hold there too, but I think it's a nice one to share with people. I think that there's enough in the book that a variety of tastes will appreciate. So,
Okay.
yeah, I think I would recommend it from that point of view. You'll probably get somebody to enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I really like the author Tayari Jones, and the name might be familiar because her last novel that she wrote, An American Marriage, was picked by Oprah for her book club, and it's really good. It's not based on a true story. It's about a man who is falsely accused of a crime, and he's a newlywed, and he gets sent to prison, and how that impacts his relationship with his wife. And really I think it's mostly told from her perspective. But her first novel, Leaving Atlanta, is based on a true story, and it's kind of interesting because it's a coming of age story, and there are 3 different characters who share their point of view, their story. But with the backdrop is the Atlanta child murders, and I didn't really know anything about this, but according to the FBI, from 1979 to about 1981, approximately 29 people in the Atlanta area, most of them black boys or teenagers, were kidnapped and murdered. And I think that there was some question of whether these were related at first, because they weren't all similar. They weren't all boys. There were some girls. The age range kind of, like I said, it was children to young men. And so I think that kind of stumped the police, but also the fact that these were black children and teens, I think you can't help but wonder if they were white, if there would have been more attention. And in fact,
Yes.
some of the neighbors have to really fight to get the police to really look at these as a series of incidents and something that really needs to be a focus of an investigation. And eventually the FBI does become involved, and they end up convicting a man called Wayne Williams for the murders of 2 of the adults. But the haunting thing about not just the real events, but this novel that Jones writes, is that you find out that the justice for these children, it never really happened. It's an unsolved. We don't know if Williams actually committed some of these crimes on the children. He was convicted of the 2, but not the other ones. And so it's just really an interesting story. Jones herself grew up in Atlanta, and I think she was a kid at this time, and so
Yeah, I remember when we were talking about this, about how it must have felt for her to be a kid, have all of these children and adults as well, but mostly children, her age, some of them.
Yeah, how frightening that must be,
Yes.
Going to school, and when I was a kid, you're not supposed to talk to strangers and everything, but that was just in general. This was kids that you were going to school with were going missing. So
That's terrifying.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and unsolved still.
Yes.
Is it written from her perspective?
So it's from the perspective of 3 different children. So I think there are 2 girls and a boy, and it's kind of divided in thirds. So you have one story, one of the girls' stories, and then the boy tells a story, and then a girl. So it's kind of an interesting way to tell that story. And it's not based on her. It's just kind of inspired by these events that happened, I believe, when she was growing up.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that she, obviously that was in her mind as she was writing this, and I think
It adds
had some
flavor,
story
yeah.
to tell about this and she told it in fiction, so she had her leeway that she could kind of do what she wanted with the story. And I really like Jones a lot, and I'll just briefly mention her third novel, Silver Sparrow, is not based on a true story, but it's my favorite one of hers. And it is about a man who is married to two women and has two daughters. And only one of the wives and one of the daughters knows about the other. So that they are aware of his public life and his first wife and daughter. But it's a great story. It's narrated by the two daughters. The secret daughter, I think, is really kind of fascinated by the daughter who kind of lucked out and gets to be the quote-unquote legitimate public daughter. And what I love about this book is that Jones does such a great job with these characters. They're so richly drawn and interesting. Even the secondary characters are three-dimensional and have these great backstories. And so I feel like when you tell somebody, oh, it's about a bigamist, like some people might not be all that interested in reading that kind of story, but she does such a good job with the characterization that it's, to me, a fine example of how reading fiction can help people become more empathetic. As studies have shown that reading fiction can make people more empathetic. I think this is the type of story that
I've heard that in relation to romance reading, actually.
Really?
Yes, specifically romance reading. So, but yeah, absolutely, for any fiction, I could see that, and putting yourself in the position of the one daughter or the other daughter. And you said very well written, so highly recommended.
Yes, I especially like Silver Sparrow. She's a great writer, but that one for me was really, really good.
I have recently finished Silka's Journey by Heather Morris. I'm not sure if it's one that is similar in the one that you've just mentioned, but I think it's definitely stuck with me ever since I read it. It's about the story of Silka, the name of the book, and also it's set around the time of World War II. I think there's a theme that I noticed in my recommendations for this podcast. It's set at Auschwitz. She's just 16 years old. It's a true story when she is taken to Auschwitz concentration camp in 1942. And unfortunately, because she's so beautiful, she ends up being the forced lover of one of the German guards, and she's unwilling, but it's a matter of survival, and that's kind of a hard subject for some people, so I could imagine some people might not want to read it, but I think the thing that makes it such a wonderful book to read is that you realize it is a true story, and that she actually, not to give away everything about the ending, but she does survive, and I think that gives me a lot of hope when I'm reading something like that. It's actually not the only book that Heather Morris wrote about Silka. She mentions her in The Tattooist of Auschwitz, a well-known book as well, and that's also based on a true story, and that's of the person Ludwig, who was given the task of tattooing the captors who entered the camp, and he knows of Silka. And when Heather Morris found out about the story about the tattooist, he told her all about what he went through, and then he casually mentions Silka, and that's where she starts investigating for her second book.
That sounds really, really good.
It is, and especially I think if you enjoy books set during World War II, Holocaust, I know that there are a lot of readers out there who do enjoy.
And survivor stories, like you said,
Yes.
knowing that, at least in her case, that she makes it out, and
Yes.
so there is that kind of hope there. It's not all
terrible.
It's traumatic, but
Yes.
there is hope at the end.
Yes, and yeah, I was really rooting for her. And
Well, I just have a couple more that I wanted to talk about. Jill Lepore is also a fantastic writer, and she writes narrative nonfiction. So I was talking about novels before, but she writes books that read like novels, but they are nonfiction. So if you like Eric Larson or Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, those kinds of books, I definitely think you should check out Jill Lepore. She's a historian, and she teaches American history at Harvard, and she's also a staff writer at the New Yorker, so she has the literary chops too. She's just really fantastic.
Yes.
And the first book that I wanted to mention of hers is The Secret History of Wonder Woman, and that is about William Moulton Marston, who is the creator of Wonder Woman. And he also, interestingly, invented or was one of the people who was working on the lie detector test. And that's kind of ties into Wonder Woman's lasso of truth that compels people to tell the truth. But it's really about his relationship. He had an unconventional life with his wife Sadie Elizabeth Holloway and Olive Byrne, who was the niece of Margaret Sanger. And they end up all living together, and they inspire, the two women inspire Wonder Woman. And so it's really a fascinating story, and something that she uncovered in doing research in the archives. And it's I guess it's interesting it also has this very feminist kind of stance. Wonder Woman was a feminist figure, and Marston himself is he thinks of his wife as being smarter than he is. And it's interesting too, in the time period, she and he both took the same classes, but she couldn't get her PhD because they wouldn't give a PhD to a woman. So anyway, it's a really interesting story, and it was on the bestseller list. Like, a lot of people were interested in it, and you don't have to be a Wonder Woman fanatic to enjoy this story. It's really good. And the other one that Jill Lepore wrote about is called Book of Ages: The Life and Opinions of Jane Franklin. And that one is about Benjamin Franklin's sister. He was very close to her. And I actually found out about this book and read it for a history of books course. And, Benjamin Franklin was a writer and printer. And this story is one that, again, Lepore went to the archives and did a lot of research. And she pieces together the biography of Jane Franklin Meekum. And she, finds these scraps of letters that survived. And again, you have a story about a woman who, Jane was as smart as Benjamin, but didn't have the advantages of being a man in the 18th century. So she was a mom and a wife. But you kind of get the sense that Benjamin was really inspired by her, and they had this really close relationship. And so if you do like history and you are kind of looking for a story that gets at, beyond the kind of stories about men, this is a story to kind of balance things out about Benjamin's sister Jane, and I recommend that as well.
I just have one more that I can speak to, and it's a historical story. It's Year of Wonders by Geraldine Brooks, and she has written a number of wonderful historical fiction novels. This one is based on a true story. Way back in 1666, the year when plague suddenly strikes a small village in England, and I suppose very topical plague. But this village responds by shutting itself away and cutting connection off with the rest of the world and dealing with the plague on its own. And you basically are reading about a really intense quarantine. So I suppose if you want to read more about people's experiences similar to what we've been experiencing, this might be it for you, but Geraldine Brooks is one of my favorite authors, and she does a really good job with this one. It's definitely, I read this one about, I don't know, several years ago, and it's stuck with me ever since. So
that's always a good recommendation when something has stuck with you.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good one. And also, it's, even though it relates to what we have recently been through, it's different because, it takes place so long ago, well before we really could still have, our virtual programs and our, Zoom meetings.
Yes. Yes, this is definitely, you get the sense of the period and the hard work that you would have to do when you were living in a village and farming, and how people dealt with disease at the time. I'm fascinated by those kind of everyday stories in history. I enjoy the daily life kind of aspect of history, and this one really just hit all those notes for me.
Yeah, that one's definitely on my list. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So all of these books can be checked out at West Allis Public Library. You can find out more at westallislibrary.org. And I just wanted to briefly mention that April 4th through the 10th is National Library Week. And we want you to know that you're welcome in the library and to connect with us beyond the walls of the library as well. That's partly why we're doing this podcast. We are open right now. We have some computers available. We have Wi-Fi access if you have your own laptop. Limited seating, and we are allowing people to browse here. We just ask people to keep their visits to 30 minutes or less. And then, of course, we have virtual programs. You can check out audiobooks and ebooks through Libby or Hoopla. And we also have access to databases like Ancestry and Creative Bug, which is this really great resource for people who are into arts and crafts projects. There are all kinds of video tutorials. Yeah.
Yes, I love that.
And if you are a West Allis resident and have a library card, which doesn't cost anything, you can access that for free. And then we are really interested. This is our first episode, so we want to hear from you. If you have any thoughts about what you'd like us to talk about for future episodes, please email us at westallislibrary@gmail.com, and we would love to hear from you.
Wonderful.
Thanks for listening to Beyond the Desk with your hosts, Elizabeth and Sarah. We hope you enjoyed our recommendations for books based on a true story. You can find the book titles we discussed in the show notes. Head to westallislibrary.org for more information. We hope you'll join us next month when Elizabeth talks with another staffer about books that explore the complex mother-child dynamic. That's all for this episode. See you next time.